Takes from New Jersey, it's the SNL Nerds, the show where two comics from New Jersey nerd out about Saturday Night Live. I'm your co-host, Darren Patterson.
And I'm your co-host, John Trumbull.
How you doing, John Trumbull?
I'm doing all right, Darren Patterson. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing fine. I'm doing dandy because we got some guests here in the house, as the kids say.
I thought it seemed a little more crowded than usual. Yes, we do have some guests.
Yeah, so we're chock-a-block full of some amazing guests for today's episode, my friend. I'll tell you.
Well, who would these guests be?
Who would these guests be? Well, why don't I just go ahead and tell you there, fella? We got two guests. We have two people who I met through mutual podcasts that we all are fans of, SNL Stats, who I guess are now SNL Network, I believe, last time I checked. But either way, go check them out. We have one guest calling in via satellite all the way in sunny LA, producer. He has a huge improv background, storyteller. And he had an SNL podcast before us. He was one of the originators. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Rich Tackenberg.
Hello, sirs.
Hi, Rich. Welcome aboard.
It's sad to say I'm an old school SNL podcaster. I was podcasting season 35 or 40 or something like that, and that was new.
Wow.
Yeah.
You were podcasting before it was cool.
And how long did you keep that going?
5 years.
Ooh.
5 seasons. Yeah.
Darren, we've got about 2 more years left in us.
That's it. The end is in sight.
And why did you stop, if that's not too personal a question?
You know what? It was I was putting too much time into that and not enough time into having a wife and other obligations on the weekend. And it was like, well, how big of a fan am I? How much of my weekend am I going to dedicate to Saturday Night Live? So we ultimately wrapped it up, and which was probably good. I'm still married and still an SNL fan, so I guess it all worked out.
And and it's good for us because it opened up a bit of the market for us.
That's right.
And
you paved the
as well.
Yes. We have a director, an improviser, actor, producer, co-owner of the Cold Town Theater in Austin, Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dave Buckman.
Hey-o.
Welcome,
Dave. Hey.
Good. Huh? Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Thanks for being here. Well, I mean, a thing we like to start with is we always like to get everybody's SNL origin stories when they come onto the show for the first time. So how did you first start watching SNL? Like, what era was it? What are some of your favorite SNL memories?
I'll go first. This is Rich. So I've seen every episode of Saturday Night Live since 1981. I will date myself. I'm in my mid 50s. I started watching SNL back, I think it was the original cast, when I was old enough to secretly stay up and watch it on my black and white 13-inch television set in my room, but not old enough to get the jokes. So I knew that they were funny, but I didn't understand why and how. And it wasn't until around kind of the Eddie Murphy years that I started to really understand the show, and then just became a huge fan and watched every Saturday night. That was helped tremendously by not having friends and not being invited to any high school parties or football games or anything else that real cool people were doing on Saturday nights, but just became a thing and always stuck with it. And I've been watching every season, highs and lows, and stayed a real fan of it through all of it. And then, as I said, ended up starting. A friend of mine, Rob Cisternino, had a big podcast for things like Survivor and Big Brother, and he had said, would you be interested in doing Saturday Night Live podcast? And I was like, well, my wife has been listening to me talk about SNL every night. Maybe I could talk to Rob about it. And so got to do that and just stayed a fan through it all.
Wow. And what did you call your SNL podcast?
I think it was just SNL recaps. It was on Rob's network. It was like the Rob Has a Podcast network, which is still very big for reality shows and a couple of other things. Right. So it was just SNL recaps.
Oh, okay, cool. And Dave, what about you?
Very similar origin story. My parents had one of the first top loading VCRs. So they had taped a lot of the first 5 years and well into the early 80s as well. And so I would watch those VHS tapes over and over on Saturday afternoons. After the cartoons were over, I would just turn to SCTV and Saturday Night Live on VHS. And then probably around 82, 83, I came online as a weekly viewer. And then as I think as Eddie Murphy was leaving and that Billy Crystal and Martin Short cast came in, I was hooked from there on out. So in my early years, I just assumed the cast turned over insanely a lot every year, because that's the way it was for my first 4 or 5 years. And then when people stuck around, it got weird for me.
Yeah, it was turning over almost every year around then, right?
81, 82, 83, 84, 85. It was like a lot of shuffling a lot. So
yeah,
I just thought that's how it was. And then all my heroes, were like had improv backgrounds. So after college, I found improv in college, and I went and made a beeline for Second City in Chicago. And I worked there as a manager and a teacher and a director and a performer, and did Improv Olympic, Annoyance, the whole Chicago improv trenches. I worked at Boom Chicago in Amsterdam as the artistic director for a little bit, director at Second City after that, and then moved down to Austin and started a improv community and theater down here. Wow. So that's where I've been for the last 15 years.
Wow, that's terrific. I mean,
Dave, I saw a lot of Boom Chicago alumni winning Emmys this weekend for pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I was there. I was there for when Brendan and Joe and Jason all met playing FIFA in the green room. I was there when Key met Peel. I was there when Seth got SNL. I was, it's just they're all good friends and kind of loving all the successes. Amber Ruffin and everybody that's just killing it from the Boom Chicago family right now.
That's fantastic.
Man. Yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, as far as SNL goes, do you guys have a favorite era? Because, I mean, usually, it goes like whatever era you discovered SNL, that's your favorite era. But what do you guys' favorite, era of the show? Rich, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I started with Eddie Murphy, and I think, as Dave said, I think the Billy Crystal year was very seminal. I thought that was amazing. But to me, my cast was Dana Carvey and Mike Myers and Phil Hartman. That was my cast, and I always think of them as just pound for pound, such heavy hitters and such a high percentage of good sketches. And clearly I have favorites through the years. Obviously, all the big, the big names, of course. I think pretty much SNL is one of the few shows where everybody who was fairly successful, I felt, was deservedly so. But Bobby Moynihan is sort of in my heart, was just someone that just really still means the world to me. So he's still my guy. But I would definitely say the Dana Carvey years were that's the thing that I latch onto.
Yeah, that was definitely my favorite era as well, because that's around when I started watching the show on a serious basis, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think we both said on this podcast, John and I, that Bobby Moynihan is like so underrated. Like he would just do like so many like little things in each sketch that kind of like if you were keeping your eye on him, you'd be like, oh wow, that guy's he's really on, he's really sharp.
And I also think that there's a love. I mean, I think to me, because, when SNL is great, it transcends just being a comedy sketch show. And I think that when Bobby is in the zone on that show, there's a love that comes through, and just a love for being there and a love for being part of a community that, at least that's what I really resonated with. And I always think that's, my favorite part. I always say that, when SNL is great, it's like being at a party. And I feel like he had that kind of love, and many people have, but that's what I always really key into, the people who you can just tell are just, their hearts are exploding on stage when it's working. That's the best.
Yeah,
absolutely,
definitely. Dave, how about you?
Yeah, I have very similar answers as well. I mean, I think I'm more drawn to performers than I am individual eras, but certainly Phil Hartman, Mike Myers, Jan Hooks is my jam.
Yeah,
as far as eras go, but I've always been very partial to these kind of like underrated performers. Like Gary Kroger was my guy. And I loved him so much when I was growing up. And then, Parnell, I think for me is my number one. I love everything Parnell touches and every sketch he's in. And for some reason, if I could be a performer on SNL, I'd want to like live in that pocket of just not liking what Will Ferrell's doing, but very cautiously going along with it. I think that to me is the funniest thing you can do. But I love all the underrated performers. I think like Jenny Slate's one season was fantastic.
Mhm.
And Michaela Watkins and just certain people I think just got swallowed up that just I wish Christopher Guest. I just finished watching that season. I went through all the 80s on Peacock this past summer, and just watching Christopher Guest kind of like not being able to find his groove was so frustrating because he was so good. He was so good in everything he did that the writing just wasn't there for him. And those kind of performances I love so much.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you look at somebody like Christopher Guest, and it is weird that he didn't make a bigger impact on the show or stick around for longer than
He was
did.
clearly unhappy. You could tell how unhappy he was. He
Yeah,
was trying.
and that Billy Crystal, Christopher Guest, Harry Shearer era, it casts a pretty long shadow when you consider that they were only there for a year. I mean, that's nuts to me to look back on that and realize that.
You know what the
And not
biggest
even a
nuts
full
to me
year.
was?
What was that, Dave?
Because
Yeah.
it was the writer's strike. The writer's strike cut it. I think it was only 17 episodes or something like that, which is
really?
insane.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
I found it
nuts.
fascinating watching that season that Billy Crystal and Christopher Guest were in so many sketches together that season.
Yeah.
And Billy Crystal never appeared in any of these Christopher Guest movies that he made. I always wondered.
I never thought of that. That's so interesting.
What happened there? I mean, Martin Short didn't
Yeah.
either, and they're good friends, but Billy Crystal never shows up in any of those movies. And I was
Neither
like, why?
is Jamie
why?
Lee Curtis, which I always thought was kind of weird.
Oh, that's very funny too.
Maybe she's just not comfortable improvising. I don't know, but yeah, Billy Crystal. Yeah, you would think he would pop up in at least a cameo.
They did so much work together.
Yeah.
And Dave, when you watch that season back, I remember it as like the cast, the season of two completely distinct, different casts. Did it feel like that watching it back, or was it actually more integrated than I remember?
Oh no, it was very segregated. It was the Second City folks. It was Belushi and Kroger and Julia and Mary Gross doing a lot of sketches together, and Christopher Guest and Billy Crystal and Martin Short doing a lot of things together. And occasionally they would pull in Gary Kroger if they needed somebody else, but they would never pull in Belushi for some reason. And all the Belushi stuff was very just dramatic and big and boisterous and over the top. And Christopher Guest was so subtle and underrated. It was such like a mishmash of contrast. And then poor Rich Hall in the middle of trying to bounce back and forth between these two camps, just trying to find his place, and Pamela Stephenson way in over her head.
Oh boy, Rich Hall! Wow, I haven't heard that name in a while.
Yeah, he's great.
Now
he moved
you know
London.
the rest of the story.
with the episode,
he moved to London and had a very prolific career as a character performer.
Yeah,
I got to meet him in Edinburgh a couple of times when I was at Boom, doing Otis Lee Crenshaw shows.
That's
his
cool.
character.
With those episodes on Peacock, I know that on some of the episodes they're edited way down, and like some episodes are only like say a half hour long or so. Is that
and no musical guests?
That era?
Yeah, no musical guests anywhere in Peacock, and maybe you only get. I mean, it's mainly Weekend Update and 3 sketches per episode is what you get.
Wow.
Occasion and a monologue. Maybe sometimes the monologue's there. Sometimes the cold opening's not there. But I'm sure it's a lot of rights issues with music.
Yeah.
Some classic sketches like the swimming, the synchronized swimming scene is not in there, which is a crime.
That's a tragedy.
Right, exactly. So it's a lot. I mean, to get through all those Brad Hall Weekend Updates was torture, but but they're so long. They're so long.
But hey, the good news is you could marathon that era pretty quickly since there are only 17 episodes and they're edited way down.
Yeah. I just jumped to the next season with Joan Cusack and Robert Downey Jr. So I'm in the middle of that right now.
Cool.
Oh,
Rich,
nice.
you had something you wanted to get in there?
Oh no, sorry, I was just messing around, hit the wrong button. But no, I mean, those eras, and I think was Tim Kazurinsky. I think was part of that group, wasn't he? Because I remember him in Weekend Update doing maybe it was a little bit later, but doing the scientist character with the words on the cards and flipping through them.
Yeah, he got cut that season with Robin Duke and Brad Hall.
Oh, okay, got
those
it.
Ringers. Yeah,
got it.
Him and Piscopo and Robin Duke all got the axe that season.
And I think Tim Kazurinsky like mainly got the gig because John Belushi recommended him, if I remember correctly.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
He was a Second City performer. and I think Ebersol came looking through Chicago, trying to um, re-spark after the Tony Rosado season.
Yeah.
And Belushi recommended Kaczynski, who's on the main stage at the Second City at the time. And Kaczynski did a lot of writing. He was an ad guy before he got to Second City.
Oh, that's
so he had already had a very prolific career writing ads in Chicago.
That's funny because Phil Hartman, I know he had an advertising background as well and a graphic design background.
Yeah.
So well, I mean, speaking of Second City, we're going to talk about one of the people who was, I'd say, one of the seminal people in the history of Second City, Mr. Del Close, and there's a new documentary that's out about him called For Madmen Only.
Yes, it was directed by Heather Ross. Came out this year. It's on streaming, all the streaming platforms right now for rent. But I believe I read it'll actually be available on Hulu starting like October 27th. And yeah, it's a documentary about Del Close, somebody who I mean, I think it's safe to say like the layman may not know the name, but if you're a comedy person, a comedy nerd, or an improv person, then you know the name Del Close. You've heard it. I'm a comic, and like I've definitely heard the name Del Close before. It's I didn't know much about him before this documentary. I just knew he was sort of this kind of mythic, mysterious figure in improv. He almost had people almost treated him like a cult leader in a weird way. Mm-hmm. That was the most I knew about him. What about the rest of you guys? Like, what did you know about Del Close? Before you went into each of your lovely improv backgrounds.
Well, I had Del for 2 weeks before he died. I was in Del's last class at Improv Olympic.
Wow.
Oh.
Wow.
Okay, so that's a yes.
You
knew him.
Yeah. I had gotten all the way through Improv Olympic classes and just gotten to that final level 6 where you kind of create a show with Del. Mm-hmm. And then he died after my second class. So I was at I.O. during that time, and it appeared a great morning for somebody I had just met. So I had seen him around the theater a lot, in the lower levels, taking classes, seeing his shows. My roommate, Ike Barinholtz, I was living with Ike Barinholtz at the time, and he was in one of Del's longest running shows at that time called the Lindbergh Babies. And I learned 2 things from Del in those 2 weeks. These are the 2 things I learned. One was, don't yawn in his presence, which I did, and he yelled at me for. And the other is, don't wear white socks on stage because it distracts the audience, which I never did again.
Oh,
so I always make sure I wear black socks when I'm performing on stage. That's pretty much it. I never really got any actual notes from Del because he was, his classes didn't involve giving you a lot of notes. It was,
but really, that's all you need to have a successful career in comedy, right? I mean, just don't yawn, no white socks.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely upped my professionalism game. I don't know how much he helped my improv, but it definitely. I was like, oh yeah, you take yourself seriously when you're trying to do this stuff and perform. It's about the audience, not you. So there were some gems in there.
I mean, but did you hear like stories about him before you met him?
Oh, for sure.
Like the lore of just stuff that was going around the campfire, as it were. Just like, oh yeah, I heard he.
Yeah, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you'd heard all the stories that they mentioned in this documentary for sure. You had heard all these things before, and but by the time I was there, he was, he's a little decrepit, and he was, he's the kind of guy that was fishing cigarette butts out of the ashtray and hitting up students for weed and going to the bathroom in the middle of your improv scene during class. He'd just get up and leave and go to the bathroom while you were performing on stage during class. And then, he'd come back and he'd still be up there because he's the one that tells you to end the scene. So so there's a lot of shit like that. And there's the misogyny and the racism and, there's another great book called Guru by my buddy Jeff Griggs, who was his final days caretaker for the last couple of years of his life. That would just was a student that Charna picked and to go over there and take care of Del, make sure he doesn't, make sure he has food, his groceries, and his there's no vermin living in his apartment. So I mean, he was a guy that we all knew that, just a dirty old hippie, the guru uh, guy that you just were in IO to take classes with eventually, and you get to work with this mad genius.
Wow.
And I got to for 2 weeks.
Okay. Rich, what about you? What had you heard about Dell?
Like, I'm not going to top Dave. Jeez, my God.
I don't know.
I mean, obviously, not nearly. I mean, on the improv side, I'll make something up if that helps. I mean, I would, yeah. I started, I moved out to LA in the early 90s, but grew up in New York, and I would go back regularly. And one of my buddies, Mark, from college, would say, you got to stay over on Sundays because there's these kids at the Soho Art Center doing these improv things, and it's unbelievable. And so I would come back like 3 times a year, and I would see what was UCB. We didn't know what it was. And it was just magic. It was really like, I would plan whole trips around. I got to be there on a Sunday because these kids were just probably my age, but I was a kid. It was unbelievable. And, but never really knowing the name Del Close at all. I only, I knew, Matt Besser and Amy Poehler and that gang and a lot of their, just from watching them. And many years later, in, probably about, I guess, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 years ago, here in LA, UCB Theater was out here. And in my day job, I was just getting a little bored and wanted to do something, and decided to take a class, took a class at UCB as Improv 101, just to do it. And I was, twice as old as everyone else who was there. And it was really fun. And I ended up going through the whole curriculum and staying for a couple of years and graduating from the school. And so, it was a time when the people who knew Del were the people that everyone else was talking about, the way that the people who knew Del used to talk about Del. So people that I knew would talk about, like, oh my God, Amy Poehler dropped into a thing, and Matt Besser did a lecture, and I went to, and these are the people that were learning from Del. So all of the I never heard like the stories of Del and much of the personality. I only knew that the Harold came from him, and a little bit about sort of that he was really influential in the UCB4, and that they had learned a lot from him, and that they gave him a lot of credit for much of what they did. But I didn't really know him. And just as a fan of comedy, I've often seen documentaries, read books. A lot of times I'll do an Audible. And there was a great book that you guys may have talked about before, but there was a book that came out a few years ago called Improv Nation, which was all about just the history of improv from the early 60s to today. And it really features Del so prominently in the book as part of the larger context. So I had just devoured that book on Audible.com and listened a couple of times. So I actually knew a lot of the stories going into this documentary because of that, but still was really excited to see it.
Oh wow. Yeah. Like, I guess as a novice, like I've said before, like I had heard the name Del. I didn't know much about him. I just like knew him as this sort of mythic figure in improv. But yeah, I would say this documentary kind of clued me into like a lot of things I didn't know, which we'll get into later. Trumbull, what about you? What did you know about Del before this?
I just sort of like knew about Del Close from afar, just through becoming a comedy nerd in like, well, I mean, I was on my way for that from childhood on. I was in an improv troupe for about 5 years there, and we always did like short form improv. It was much more whose line is it anyway, other than like Harold long form improv Olympic type stuff. At times I was trying to get the group to like go into the city and be part of the day long improv marathon that they do on Del Close's birthday, if I remember correctly. But I couldn't really get anybody else in the group behind on that. And I'm also acquainted with John Ostrander, who is a comic writer who was one of the people interviewed in this movie, even for Madmen only, who was Del Close's co-writer on the Wasteland comic book, which they talk about quite a bit in the movie. And in fact, the very first time I met John Ostrander, I was having lunch with him with a couple mutual friends. And pretty much the first thing I asked him about was like if he had any Del Close stories. And he told me a great story of like where Del thought he was having spiritual visions in his apartment, because like when he would go and stand at a particular area of his apartment, he would have these just incredible intense sensations, and then eventually they found out that there was like a little bit of exposed wiring around the floor there, so he was actually getting mildly electrocuted in that area. So,
oh man, yeah.
I'm
I
sure I'm
mean,
not doing the story justice, but and I remember in the early 2000s, I read Kim Howard Johnson's book about Del Close, the funniest one in the room, and it's been long enough that I don't remember nearly enough about the book. I should give it a reread, but I remember really liking it, and he's a pretty fascinating character. So, and Del Close is also just such a seminal guy in the history of comedy because he trained so many people. He trained like John Belushi, Bill Murray, Chris Farley, Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, Tim
everybody up,
Penrose.
yeah, the SCTV crew up in Canada.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I didn't know that. I didn't know he went all the way back to Nichols and May. That's kind of surprised me.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, this this documentary, it seemed like a good overview of his career. I thought, it gives you, I think, the basics of Del Close. I mean, how would you guys rate it as in terms of the information that it contains? Rich, we'll start with you, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was. I mean, I really liked it. It was really fun. We watched it. I think the weekend it came out, we knew about it and watched it when it first came out. I don't think that I learned a lot more that I didn't know, but I think I was the very minor majority. I think for the most part, it seemed pretty on. A couple of things that I'm always the nerd that's like, Dell actually didn't create the kitchen rules. That was Elaine May and Ted Flicker. That's not actually. Who cares?
Right.
In the scheme of it, I think they captured it, and I think that they captured the spirit of it. Obviously, I didn't have 2 classes with Dell, so who am I to say? But it seemed like it captured the spirit of it, and because I always got the sense from hearing about the legend of Dell. I think the lack of his success is one of the biggest parts of Dell's story of commercial success in as opposed to all the people that he came up with and trained, or many of the people. And I felt like it captured that. It's almost a sad story as much as an uplifting story, and I liked that. I felt like it captured that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did know they did talk about that in the doc, where they say, yeah, he came up with Nichols and May, and he in the '60s he taught like Howard Hessman, like they interview Howard Hessman, Johnny Fever from WKRP in there, and all these other iconic characters from SNL and SCTV, and they all kind of surpassed him, and he kind of was a little bit bitter about that. But at the same time, he is a guy who doesn't compromise, and he has this artistic vision that he has to see through, and he wants to, he has this pure artistic vision, and he's doing it. But at the same time, he also wants the fame and the money and recognition too. So it's like sort of it's a bit of a dichotomy there.
Well, and it was interesting. I want to hear what David says, but like being in LA, like when I took classes, most of the people I was taking it with were wannabe actors, writers, Saturday Night Live performers, wannabe. And it was always the interesting debate of that. It felt like improv was an unbelievable amount of fun, but also a necessary tool to potentially get you to that next step. But it was, but the dream was, could there ever be a way that doing improv in and of itself could be a lucrative career that would make you famous? And even in whatever that was, 2010, 2014, no one had cracked it any more than Dell, who had tried to crack it in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it still seems to be that sad thing that it's just, when it's great, it's just magic, but it never translated to TV or film or large scale theaters, or some way where you could make a lucrative living just off that alone, not being a launching point to something else. And I feel like that's really the spirit of sort of the sadness around his genius.
Well said.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with a lot of that. I think it skimmed over a lot in his life, but there certainly wasn't anything in the documentary that I hadn't heard of before.
Okay. Well, I mean, did you hear the story? Because there's a couple stories here that I wrote down. Then I was like, I don't know if this is true. I think somebody mentioned that he met Tennessee Williams, and he shook hands with Tennessee Williams, and like a roach sort of crawled out from underneath his sleeve and onto Tennessee Williams' hand. Like I was like, that sounds a little too fantastical to me. And there was also another story in the doc where somebody mentioned, oh yeah, he met L. Ron Hubbard, and he sort of accidentally, inadvertently gave him the idea to start up Scientology.
I believe that. I believe that one.
Really?
I believe both of those. I mean, but also, they freely admit even the story about his dead suicide is a legend, not actual fact.
Yeah,
So
that was really interesting. Was though they
there's
introduced they introduced like Dell's version of it with his dad committing suicide in front of him at age 10, and then very close to the end of the documentary, they talk to Kim Howard Johnson, among other people, who says, "Yeah, that wasn't exactly true. He was actually like 20 when his dad died, and it wasn't in
sure.
front of him." And you're just like, "Oh wow!" But
And
at the
but
same time, it was like emotionally true for Dell, even if
Yeah.
it wasn't literally true.
He's a showman. He's
Yeah.
a carnival act, and he knows how to tell a good story. Even Sharna spills the beans after the credits about the skull that they held on to that I actually believed was his skull.
Mhm.
I was a student there. I'd be like I'd seen the skull that they had on display, and I
Right.
believed it at the time. And so, it's from birth to death. He knew the story was better than the actual story. You know what I mean?
And the skull story, in case people don't know it, is after he died, he wanted his actual skull to be used in theatrical productions of Hamlet.
Which they did at the Goodman.
Like supposedly they had like beetles eat away the flesh from his skull, and then they used it, and then the truth came out years later that this wasn't his actual skull. So
Right.
it was like
So,
almost this Andy Kaufman type of thing.
All of those stories, and he was crazy into rituals, and a lot of his shows that he had developed at IO, not so much the Second City shows, but the IO shows were very ritual based and spiritually based. So he knew how to show a better story than the actual story behind.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot of it was smoke and mirrors. The Herald is smoke and mirrors. Finding the game of the scene in improv is smoke and mirrors. I hate when I'm teaching a level 2 class and I have to tell them, look, I'm going to break improv for you today. The magic that you think this is, that magic is going to go away today because I'm going to teach you how to play a game, how to find a game, how to heighten the game, and how to edit it so it looks like magic. And you can see a lot of their hearts a little bit broken when they learn how to do it. And but it's a necessary way to kind of teach the new level, the new generation of magicians.
It's like when you get to that particular level of Scientology, and they tell you all the secret stuff about thetans and all that, and you everyone's just like, oh no.
But hey, if I'm doing a lot of acid and mushrooms in Hyde Ashbury in the 60s, I don't doubt for a minute that he met L. Ron Hubbard and helped him develop Dianetics.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that makes sense. Well, I mean, that's something that they do talk about in this doc about. He was big into the drugs, as the kids say. He's just dropping acid and whatnot, and like especially his time in the '60s when he was directing an improv group and with Howard Hessman in it. Like I said, he became the director of it's called The Committee, was the name of the improv group, and through his drug fueled haze, he was able to sort of create long form improv, which we now know it as the Herald. And he said he got the name from another improviser, I believe.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that just a clarification that the Herald is one of many types of long form improvisation. But he certainly cracked a certain way of doing it. There's a whole other branch of San Francisco improv that is much more narrative and plot based, but he developed this, I guess, what we now know as Chicago based improv, in terms of making rather improv be less about following a hero's journey and a narrative in a story, but have more thematic type shows where the characters in the relationship are more important than this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens kind of story. So it's all based on a general theme rather than trying to find some sort of linear plot.
Oh. I didn't know that. Like I know some improv. I didn't even know there was like different types. Like you just mentioned Chicago improv. I didn't know if like there was like
I
a
would say
regional.
there's this whole other West Coast, San Francisco, Vancouver kind of theater sports that you'd find on improv. Whose Line Is It Anyway? Kind of improv,
Mhm.
and then there's this whole other um, BATS improv version from Gary Johnstone, which is very hero's journey narrative, hour and a half long story improvs. That's another form of long form improv.
Oh.
Compared with the
Dave, when
Harold, which came out of Chicago.
Dave, you were saying about sort of teaching the Harold and breaking the magic, and it so resonates because as I said, when I used to see the UCB in the '90s, it was just magic. I mean, me and my buddy Mark, we would go to eat afterwards at 1 a.m. and just like, how did they do that? And then taking classes at UCB and learning the format of the Harold. What was interesting for me is then I would go see ASCAT, which is not technically a Harold, but I would see other Harolds, and I was like, oh, I went from watching magicians to major league sports players because I was like, oh, now I'm watching, like, I understand
Technique.
what you're doing, but you have a level of talent that, I mean, I took improv for 5 years, and on my best day, I couldn't have held 2 minutes to what and that was its own kind of appreciation. And I now still love seeing improv, and it's like, I know what they're doing. I just don't know how they did it, and that's still to me is magic.
There's a whole other level beyond the magic tricks of finding the game and heightening the game that comes with rapport, of playing with the same people for years. I was in a troupe down here in Austin with my wife and another couple, Bob McNichol and Erica May, who now run an improv theater called The Lab in Ambler, Pennsylvania. The four of us were a troupe for about 11 years, and my work with them far surpassed anything I ever did at Second City, anything I ever did at Boom Chicago artistically, because we had developed an 11-year rapport of how to improvise with each other, where we were having a show, we were having a conversation with our eyes that the audience is not aware of. And so we could, the way we looked or the way you moved or the way you approached a chair, you kind of knew what the other person was thinking and where they were going with it.
Right.
So
I got a little of that in my group out of order when we were together for like 5 years. After like a year, 2 years together, we all learned how to like pick up each other's signals enough that we could you could like steer the scene in a way, or you knew how to send a signal to one of your fellow improvisers. I remember like at one point when we were auditioning new people for the group, and one of the people I was up on stage. I was doing a 2-person scene with them, and the guy like broke the first rule of improv. First rule of improv, you do yes and I started out the scene, and I think I established like, oh, we were at a hockey game or something, and he was like, oh, what are you talking about? We're sitting at home watching TV. And I just immediately went, oh, okay, I guess I'm the asshole. And which was really just my way of saying like, okay, well, fuck you. If you're not going to adhere to the reality I established, you steer the scene. Let's see what you got, Mr. Comedy. And needless to say, that guy didn't make it into the group. But like after that, me saying like, I guess I'm the asshole, that was sort of my way of signaling to the other people in the group, like, okay, this is not going anywhere good.
Oh man.
Yeah, I can remember auditioning for the Second City Touring Company, and I had been performing a lot there at Improv Olympic, and I think I had just come back from Boom Chicago, and they put me in a scene at the audition with some guy who had never been on stage before, and he literally started doing Van Down by the River and Samurai.
Oh wow!
Samurai in the middle of the scene.
Wow.
Like, I'm not. I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm not. He was like steering it there. And the suggestion was skee ball. So I just made this guy the best skee ball player in the world. Like everything he was doing was awesome. And that's yes, Van Down by the River and Samurai is how you play skee ball. And we're going to just work your ideas into the skee ball scene. And I got a call back, I think, from doing that just by I think they knew. I didn't have to call it out. They knew that guy was a train wreck. I think they wanted to see what I was going to do with him. And I think I got that call back based on just like completely just like buying into his reality, that was an appropriate thing to be doing.
Well, see, that's great. Yeah, you did the best you could.
And that guy was Chris Farley.
Yeah. That's where the sketch came from.
Very nice.
Bob Odenkirk was in the audience, just writing it down as and what you saw on Saturday Night Live was verbatim.
Wow. And history, and now you know the rest of the story. Call that a callback, kids.
Love it.
I thought it was really interesting to hear like the reminiscences of people who knew Del or interviewed Del, and they had stories to tell, like George Wendt and Bob Odenkirk. I wish there had been a little more of that. Of course, like there are certain people that we can't hear from any longer, like John Belushi or Chris Farley, who are no longer with us, and then people who, for whatever reason, didn't talk to them in new interviews, like Bill Murray or Tina Fey. So I wish we could have gotten like a more comprehensive picture of the guy, and so I feel like in some ways it's a shame that they didn't do this movie 10 years ago, even when we could have talked to more of those people, you know?
No, absolutely. Yeah, the way they created this doc was pretty interesting because it's like you said, it was like half of it was, or a good portion of it was like just talking heads, interviews, George Wendt and Bob Odenkirk. And then they also included sort of this, I guess, this dramatic, recreation of young Del Close creating the Wasteland comic with,
John
Matt
Ostrander and Mike Gold.
Exactly. And it was like them sort of recreating what they, them. It was the recreation of them making the comic book, and that was just kind of stuck in and kind of sprinkled out throughout the doc. I mean, I don't know if that was a, I don't know. That kind of took me out of the documentary a little bit. I don't know.
I liked that. I felt like it broke up the documentary so that it wasn't just talking heads. I thought, obviously, never meeting Del Close, I thought James Urbaniak was great as Del Close.
Perfect. Perfect.
Yeah. So I really liked that. I felt like it. I think I liked the talking heads pieces more because of those. I would say I don't know that, if I were writing, and I don't write movies for a living, I don't know what I would have picked. I don't know that anchoring it around the comic book did anything for me personally, because I didn't know why this moment in time was such a pivotal moment in the life of Del Close. That I never really understood. So it felt like I liked them as these little standalone moments, but I don't know that for me it moved the story of Del Close forward at all.
Yeah, I think that was it. Like it didn't.
Yeah.
I
think they made the choice to center it around the creation of the Wasteland comic book because so much of the Wasteland comic book was built around stories that Del Close had. But they didn't really delve into any of the individual stories. They just kind of showed snippets. And at the beginning, I thought, oh, wow, they're really kind of doing John Ostrander a disservice because they kind of painted him as like, oh, he's this nerdy guy who was just like lucky to be there in the same room as him. And I'm like, well, no, John Ostrander brought something to the party too. I mean, he was established as a writer and he was also an actor in the Chicago scene. And so that raised my hackles a little bit just because I know John personally, not real well, but and the scene where like they had Del Close calling into DC Comics and they had Lauren Lapkus as the assistant who was having to deal with his calls. I was like, okay, first of all, that looks nothing like what DC Comics looked like in the 1980s. It wasn't anywhere near that uptight of an office. So that I had a little trouble with that scene.
Ironically, it's funny. I loved that. To me, that with Lauren and Lennon Parnham, it was a moment of just comedy for the sake of comedy that was almost certainly improved. And I wish that the movie had more of that because it captured more. I felt like of the spirit of like, oh, this is a movie about comedy, and I wish I was laughing more. And that had that moment to it for me.
Yeah,
it was a scene that Del would have loved. I think I would have loved that scene. Just how grounded and normal it felt, the conversation.
I couldn't get on board with that scene just because I knew it wasn't truthful. So I was like, okay, first of all, who are you playing? And second of all, that just looks like generic Office. It doesn't. The DC offices were much more fun than that. In the mid '80s, they had like Ben-Day dots on the wall and stuff like that. When you would walk into the offices at DC Comics, you knew that it was the offices of comic book company. They'd had a statue of Clark Kent reading a copy of the Daily Planet in the waiting room, and there was like a full size phone booth there. So I
I
was just
think
like,
I think the point of the scene was very well put in that nobody in the real world cares about Dell or cared
yes,
about Dell
yeah,
except for comedians and comic book writers who
yeah,
are fascinated by the guy and hold him as a mythological uh, um, god of some sort, whereas everybody else in the rest of the world, even if they enjoy the comedy he's brought forward, they could care less about his eccentricities or his legends or his rituals. You know what I mean?
yeah,
They don't
yeah.
they don't care as much. And
I
that's kind
mean,
of what they were
I
discussing in that scene is we don't give a shit. Just do what the fuck you're gonna do,
That's true.
artsy
That's
guy.
true. And that's, I mean, coming from the comic book world too, that's something I'm very used to. Like people who've had
Hmm.
like a huge influence on the comic book world, like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko, and the average man on the street doesn't know their names when they
Or
created
want to
like,
know.
yes, exactly. I mean, I remember like a friend of mine on Facebook, he's a photographer and he does a thing where he will post a photo of a celebrity with a camera of some kind. You know, he's like, here's an uber cool celebrity with an uber cool camera. And around the time I think it was Jack Kirby's 100th birthday was coming up, I was like, hey, here's a picture of Jack Kirby with a camera. You should, put this up when his birthday rolls around. And my friend replied, "Who?" Oh, my heart just sank because I was like, "How do you not know who Jack Kirby is?" Um,
Hmm.
but that being said, like even though I thought they were doing John Ostrander a bit of a disservice at the beginning, I liked how they gave him like one of the last words in the movie, and he said one of the more insightful things towards the end of the movie, where he was like, even if the details of the story aren't true, it's still worthwhile because like stories are just lies that have like a bit of truth in them. And I really like that. And I thought that was one of the better moments in the movie. So I felt like they redeemed John somewhat by the end.
Absolutely. I don't know, Rich. What are your thoughts on the doc of the whole? Like, what did you like? What did you not like?
I as an improv fan nerd, I liked that they featured a couple of people who I find hilarious that are not necessarily big names. David Pasquazi and
Hmm.
who I just think is so amazing, and Craig Kakowski and one of his partners. Like it
Mm-hmm.
was just I really like to see people who, if you are a comedy nerd, these people are very funny, even if they're not the big names. I also would say I did like the animation style. I don't think that they invented it at this point, but I think that they did keep it moving along when there wasn't actual pieces. I loved some of the found footage. For me personally, I would have loved more actual bits. I think even when they had a bit from the committee of which I barely recognized anybody. I don't know the committee, but they did a national people doing the national anthem, and one guy refuses to stand, and I was like,
That
Oh
was
yeah,
hilarious. That
that's
was
a good
terrific.
sketch. Like that, you could
Yeah.
play that sketch today. That would, I could see that happening at Dodger Stadium tonight. So,
Yeah.
like, and I do think that I wish that there were time for more of that in the piece. Seeing John Belushi with a fish, like he did a sketch at Second City involving a fish, and like there was one line, and it was just really funny. And I think that I would love to have seen more of that. And I realize there's a lot of issues around that, but I liked that there was that. So a lot of that stuff I liked. I liked seeing the Canadian stuff, and anytime we get to of all the when we think about the people that Del worked with at Second City, all the huge names that came out of that, but we actually featured Bob and Doug McKenzie of the Great White North, which for me, I loved Bob and Doug McKenzie. So that I was a huge fan of. I like that a
Mm-hmm.
lot. So yeah, I thought that was fun. I think one of my bigger regrets is that I think that there were so many people talking about why he was so influential and talked about him in very broad terms about how he wanted you to be fearless and kind of, the basic tenets. But I don't know that I ever really heard someone really explain how he made them a better improviser. Even if it was an example that I, as a sort of outside person, wouldn't understand, it did feel very repetitive to me because people weren't getting in the weeds, and I don't know why, but I felt like I kind of like, I don't know that I took away that I thought he was a genius. What I took away is that people who I respect thought he was a genius, and I only scratched the surface of why. I don't know if you guys had the same thing or if that was just me.
Well, I'll
I don't
let you
know.
guys speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're a hardcore person into anything, I think you always wish like a documentary would go more in depth because you're always looking to discover more about that thing that you're passionate about. Um, like there was one bit where I was like, "Well, wait a minute, what's that about? Let's get into that a little bit." Where Dave Thomas mentioned offhand that Martin Short hated Del Close. I was like, "Well, wait a minute,
Yes.
let's delve into that for a few minutes. Like, tell us why he hated Del Close or
There
why
was a
Del
lot
Close."
glossed
Yeah,
over the people that did not like Dell and the
yeah.
reasons
I kind of
why.
wish they didn't
So I
gloss
felt
over
like
that.
there was a lot of love for Dell in this documentary, but there's also a lot of other documentaries about Dell. And I
Hmm.
feel like this one kind of, they all kind of like hold their cards close to their chest because they never know which one's going to be like
Right.
the right one, So they got like some really good famous people to comment in this one. But they were also trying to make Guru its own narrative movie based on that book. And then I think there's another one. One of my buddies is writing about Dell and Sharna's relationship. That's in pre-production right now. So there's a lot of different legends about Dell, some good and some bad. This one I think glossed over a lot of the bad. They kind of like even the stuff about him like having to go to a psychiatric hospital,
Hmm.
and having to be pulled out to come do shows and put back. It was just very like ha ha ha, kind of like isn't this a crazy? But why he was there is never really discussed. The the way he treated people was not good.
Hmm.
However, he why he was important was that because he developed a style of comedy that we all have the benefit today of feeling like, okay, that is how funny works. But if you ever see comedies from the late 70s and early 80s and the early 70s, comedy generally as a rule doesn't hold up, but comedy back then was really not funny. You'd see some of these older Silent Life sketches or older comedies of these feature films, and you think to yourself like, how is this funny? Like, what is the joke here? Like, why didn't the audience laugh once at a Weekend Update for like 3 or 4 years? Because they weren't telling jokes; they were saying weird things and hoping the fact that it was weird was funny enough.
Uh-huh.
Um, and Dell figured out how to mine patterns and relationships and uh, for comedy, and how to you go deep with relationships with truth and honesty, and then you find repeatable patterns that audiences can recognize and the actors can repeat, and heightening stakes. And he kind of developed this comedy that we all take for granted right now that doesn't seem so hard anymore to get because it's pretty ubiquitous form of comedy. But back then, nobody knew how to do that, and he kind of figured it out. So he is a genius, but he's also really hurtful to a lot of people too. So I think for the most part, the documentary wanted to make nice, to the people who love Dell, and kind of get their involvement. I don't think you're going to get Sharna involved in something that's going to like bring out the dark side of Dell, or
Hmm.
a lot of those people that love Dell. They're not going to open up. Andrew Alexander, of course, from Second City, who they all have their own legacy to protect too. And if Dell's goes down, theirs also goes down
Mhm.
to some extent.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Dave. I thought this documentary was good, but it was sort of it's a nice primer. I thought for me, like
Yes.
it's a good idea. I mean, it's a good documentary just to get the basics about who he was and what he did. But yeah, I did find myself wanting, just a little bit more. I just really wanted to get more to the meat of it because it's like what you said. It did like touch on a few things, but it didn't really get into it. Like like Trumbull, like you said, like where they said where David Thomas was like, yeah, Martin Short hated him. I was like, well, why?
Yeah.
Let's get into that. Like, they talked about him. They talked about him like ODing. Yeah, there's a story there, but
if you know
it is a
story.
The whole thing is a story. It's a this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened documentary.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and like they also told a story about where I think it was after Belushi died. Like Del like really went on a big drug bender, and he tried to fight one of his students, and like John Candy had to get in the middle of it, and it got so bad they had to like pretty much throw him out of Toronto or something. Like
right.
It's I don't know. I would have just loved to know more about that. His like. His dark
he was
side.
A crazy person, and crazy people were allowed to. Crazy men were allowed. Crazy white men were allowed to be crazy white men for pretty much up until last year.
Yeah.
So
like Dave Thomas says no, he was a legit madman. He was legitimately crazy.
And so, people celebrated white guys for so long that were genuinely insane that we would not allow to have that kind of sway over people anymore. But Del was one of those guys that were just like, people just excused his faults for the sake of his genius, which is how so many other heroes of ours have come down, like Bill Cosby or Louis C.K. or any one of those guys that just like, geez, like Woody Allen, like heroes that of mine that you just, I can't, it's hard to look at their art anymore. And we're lucky that Del's art is vanishes in the air as soon as it's done. So
yeah, I like the metaphor that he had towards the end of the doc where he talks about like fireworks are the only more ephemeral medium than improv, because it's gone within a few seconds.
For sure. So his influence is there, but I also don't think the documentary did a great job of showing great improv. I wish this documentary could have like shown me some truly funny things happening in those clips from the late 60s, early 70s when he was doing shows after the sketch show at Second City, where he'd have his own underground workshop. I wish there's something in there that made me like, yeah, that's good improv. It's a good representation of what I do. There's nothing. It's hard to find that. I just wish somebody would crack that code of being able to show improv.
There was a story in the Truth in Comedy book that he co-wrote with Charna, and I think there was a third co-author on that, and I'm blanking on the name, and I don't have the book handy. But they were talking about like supporting your fellow team members in the improv scene, and like somebody had started a scene that established that they were at a high school prom, and they said Bill Murray immediately just grabbed someone else and just started dancing in the background just to like lend that atmosphere to the scene. And that was like one of their examples of like how you support without like taking over the scene.
Yeah.
And yeah, it would have been nice to see more stuff like that. Like that committee scene, that was hilarious. I would have loved to have seen more of that, and just like,
that was a sketch. What
Del gave us the tools to do.
Yeah. That was a written sketch. That was what we call a blackout sketch, which is no longer than a minute. It's just one joke. Very similar to Second City style.
Yeah, I mean, they had like a few improv sketches, but yeah, it was mostly just to show up the famous people that were in it. Like that one they had with Bill Murray in it. I believe I think it was Andrea Martin. I could be mistaken, but yeah,
it looked like her. It sure looked like her.
It did, right? All right, it's not just me. Yeah, but he just like showing clips of improv scenes that just happen to have people who went on to become famous, like Rachel Dratch and Adam McKay and Matt Besser and even Jon Favreau. I had no idea Jon Favreau took improv, but they had a clip.
Oh yeah, he was at IO.
Wow,
that makes sense.
And I think that problem is very.
Chicago guy.
And I think the problem that we're talking about is very indicative of just improv as an art form, because I know from people at UCB and people who've done, tried to put improv on TV, or even, put together, promo reels of famous improv groups. And there's something that gets lost when you try to edit. It's like, well, you can't have, you have to kind of be in the room, and I'm not smart enough to figure it out. But I think that I've seen that time and time again, that if you're not there where you actually hear the suggestion, and then there's this beat and but then when you try to make it a clip, it's 4 minutes, and 4 minutes doesn't really hold when you're watching it on TV. And I think that's really that like Dave said, I think I struggled with not seeing the brilliance of what Del was doing. And that, I think, is the existential issue with why, one of the reasons why these people who are only great improvisers are people we don't know, because it is so hard to capture outside of being in the room, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you took a really good troupe and filmed them doing 30 different improv shows, you could probably get 5 of them to be worth editing down to a half an hour show for television. I think that's the only way you could do it, is by quantity and taking the best of them. And you could have a TV show if you had the patience for that and the money for that. The TJ and Dave movie, Trust Us, This Is All Made Up, is maybe the best example of seeing improv filmed, because I think they really nailed how to do it. Alex Karpovsky directed it. And it's a fantastic document of what good long form improv is. That's TJ Jagodowski and Dave Pasquesi doing a 2-person show. There's a little bit of behind the scenes stuff of the day leading up to this show, but the show that they capture is fantastic.
Dave, I think I've seen that movie 9 times, maybe 10 times. And I skipped the behind the scenes and the afterwards, and it is just perfection. It is so amazing. But I don't know that if I said to you, hey, Dave, could you cut me a 2-minute trailer of that movie? I don't know that it would be that funny. And I think that's the challenge.
No. Yeah, for sure.
Back in I don't know if it was the 90s or early 2000s, Bravo recorded, they did a pilot of ASCAT, the UCB main show, back when the UCB 4 were still doing it, before a lot of the success. And I remember I was so excited. My friends were there. They had seen it filmed. They recorded two shows, and remember watching it on Bravo, and it was like, it was okay. Like, it wasn't great. And in my head, I'm like, oh, they must have not recorded a great night. And my friend who was in the audience said, it was hilarious. And it just didn't translate.
Those are some of my favorite improvisers ever.
Yeah.
In that cast. And I've seen so many of their live shows, that those group of people, when they were back in Chicago, before they'd moved to New York. And they're all unbelievable improvisers. And that show on those DVDs is about a 7 or an 8 compared to what I've seen them do.
Wow.
Right.
Before.
Okay. Actually, Rich, this doesn't have anything to do with the doc, but I just got to ask you, since you've said you've been to so many UCB shows and you're a fan of it. Like, what's one of the most memorable shows you've seen at UCB? Does you have one that sticks out in your mind? I'm just curious.
Oh, yeah, there's tons, and the magic of improv is it won't mean anything to you. It was Matt Walsh screaming.
Well, please tell us.
It was a moment where Matt Walsh screamed at Adam McKay, "He will tag you back," and that happened in 2001. And me and my buddy Mark still quote it today. It was one of the funniest things, but it doesn't mean anything now. It's completely lost to the ether. And seeing, certainly seeing the talent, I saw a lot of people back in the day, as, Dave talked about, some people who obviously went on to be famous, but also just to remember there were a couple of people that there was an improviser named Miriam Tolan who was just amazing. And it was like, oh, and Rachel and made it, and Rachel Dratch made it, and Tina Fey made it from that era, and Miriam didn't. And it always seemed to me so random them, why certain people made it.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was just moments of magic, and the I'll always remember, because obviously all of those people were just amazing, and everyone in the movie was amazing. But I always remember back at the day that it was Amy Poehler was the one who could turn a scene. She somehow turned it 90 degrees with one sentence that was always like, I remember thinking, if I was up there and we paused and you said, okay, come back tomorrow with your best line, I wouldn't have thought of that. And she thought of it in the moment. And those moments of magic, I never shook. It was just so great.
All right.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's what's so amazing about a good improv scene, and it's also such a rush when you're in a great improv scene, is like you're removing those barriers between thinking of something and doing it. You just do it in the moment that you think of it. And I found like when I was in scenes like after the show, I would almost go blank with it because it's almost like you're hypnotized. You're like you've kind of removed your conscious mind from it, and then like somebody tells you about it afterwards and you're like, oh yeah, I do kind of remember that, but like in the moment you don't necessarily remember that.
It's
Awesome.
like it's like listening to somebody else describe a dream that they just had, and it's the
Right.
most boring thing you could ever hear in your life when somebody's trying to describe an improv show to you. And it's, I've gotten okay at it when I have to tell my wife about something good that happened during the show that night. She's an improviser too, so she can take it. But trying to
Right.
describe an improv scene to somebody that's not an improviser is
Oh,
excruciating, because you feel
It's
like such
the
an
very
idiot.
essence of you had to be there.
Yeah,
Wow. Okay.
because there's just so much context. All of comedy is context and inside joke, and if you weren't there for the beginning and the seed of the context, the humor part kind of uh, is irrelevant. If you that's the David Letterman notion that all comedy is an inside joke. So he would like do a bit at the top of a show, and if you tuned in late to a Letterman episode and he was already on this bit that the audience understood and Paul Schaefer understood, and everybody laughing at it because they were there at the beginning of the episode, but if you missed it, it wasn't funny to you. So
Right.
the same thing happens when in an improv show. If you're not there for the formation and the germ of the idea, it kind of just, it's a little flat.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Exactly.
there's something I was going to say about the movie too. That in this, since we're talking about improv in general, one of the things that that I was interested to hear Del talk about at the end, or I think it was Adam McKay talked about Del, how back in the '80s where it was really he the messaging in the world was it's all about you, and you are the greed is good, and if you're going to be successful, you're going to be the one who makes it happen, and this idea of community and trusting each other and not being the spotlight. To me, that is I would love to have heard more, but I really liked that was a real part of it. And in the movie they show Del at the very end, before he passes away, sort of talking about a little bit of that, because I think that as a fan of comedy, as a fan of improv, I just went because it was funny. It just made me laugh, and it kind of was shock and awe. But as someone in their 40s who didn't want to be a performer but who took a class, I think that's one of the things that kept bringing me back, was that this idea of like, boy, I wish life was more like this, where we just we just support each other. If someone's a real dick, they're probably going to sort of get phased out of the group, and it's not going to be about that. And I like that the movie sort of touched on that. I would love to have heard more, but it seems so counter to who Del was as a human being. It seemed like he had this wonderful ideal that he in no way embodied in any aspect of his own life.
That's wow. I mean, that's a fantastic note to wrap this thing up on. I mean, that makes
Well put.
perfect. Yeah, Del. Yeah. So, I mean, as far as documentary goes, I enjoyed it. I liked it. I would recommend it to people. Definitely people who don't know who Del is. I would say just totally watch it, and it'll open up your eyes to like a lot of stuff you didn't know. Where you're like, oh, this guy created all of this. He created pretty much everything in comedy I like. It'll open your eyes. I recommend this doc highly.
If anyone out there has never seen a Harold, watch any episode of Modern Family. That is a Harold. how they structure that story.
Really?
That is a herald.
Oh,
That's interesting.
Very
Okay.
interesting.
Wow,
Now I want to go
thought-
back
Not
and
my
watch one.
Not my favorite show, but widely acknowledged that those are heralds. Story structure.
Wow.
Okay,
I
that's
never thought of
interesting.
that.
I've never heard that before, so I'm going to look at Modern Family in a new way now. So,
Wow.
well, Rich and
All
Dave,
right,
thank
guys,
you so much for joining us for this. Where can people find you on the interwebs or follow you online?
I'm on Twitter at RichTack, and hopefully by the time this comes out, there will be live storytelling back in LA again in person. But in the meantime, covering SNL with my friends over at, as you said, the SNL network. I will have been on the season premiere episode, which is probably already aired, and we'll be doing that regularly. Very excited to dig into a new season and to see the show again.
Awesome. And you can follow me at Dave Buckman on Twitter. You can also reach out to me on Facebook or Instagram if you want. And you can also find out more about Cold Town Theater at Cold Town Theater, ColdTowne theater.com, as well as Austin Sketchfest at ATX Sketchfest.
Fantastic.
Okay.
And as always, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Darren Credible. That's DARIN Credible.
And you can follow me on Twitter at Trumbull Comic. That's TRUMBULL and the word comic. And you can follow the show page at SNL Nerds Show. So that's it for this week, for this special episode about for Madmen only. Go check it out on your streaming service and learn a little about one of the seminal figures in comedy. So I think that's about it for this episode. Darren, do you have anything else?
No, I think we're good. I think we got to the heart of it. Were they supposed to yes and that, or I don't know?
That's good enough, you know.
Well, I guess I'm the asshole.
There you go. Call back. So we will see you next time.
Yes, and a lovely host.
Well, thank you very much. So we'll see you next time, and until then,
Nerds out.
This has been a non-productive media presentation. Executive producer Frank Hablawi. This program and many others like it on the Non-Productive Network is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. Please share it, but ask before trying to change it or sell it. For more information, visit non-productive.com.